Once again, a very good evening to you. If you joined us, you are listening and in the company of Sweet Town Internet Radio with myself and co-host Declan Ford.
Donald, how are you doing?
If I couldn't be any better, I don't believe, under the circumstances.
Excellent.
But.
And what are we at today?
Today I was at a meeting in Clogher.
Now. Clogher, 5
Mile Town, that's right. And then I came home and I cut sticks. That's what I do for therapy.
You cut sticks?
Yes. For the winter.
For the winter?
I have a little charnwood stove in my room. I build a house and live in the garage, you know. I put a stove in the garage and that's where I live.
You're just sitting there chopping wood.
Aye.
I can imagine you with your penknife whittling away, making all kinds of wee wooden whistles.
Yes.
Or knives. Or wee figurines.
It's a lonely life, you know.
Of course it is, but you've got all your tapes to listen to and all your CDs to play.
Yes. But on Saturday morning I had to take part in a Zoom conference. Now, you wouldn't know what that is. That's
Zoom.
A Zoom.
Let's tell you. Do you see, since COVID started, I have discovered Zoom.
Have you indeed?
Except, like a lot of the stupid politicians, they forget they mute it. So they're talking away and it's just mime. So unless you can lip read, you don't know. But I can manage it, you know. I have quizzes with the offspring a couple of times a month.
Yes. And I was telling my son Jonathan the other day, everybody's house looks so nice, all these top floor apartments and then this lovely drawing room with all the binded leather books and leather sofas.
Yes.
Mine's had the backdrop because the day or two before it, the curtains that I've washed had blew into the orchard. I took them in to dry them inside and they were like a leaning tower of Pisa on a clothes horse.
Right.
And the remains of the last night's Chinese and a bottle of beer maybe lying on the table, you know, the usual bachelor stuff that you'd have.
The shame of it.
Embarrassment of it. And then I telling my son this, he says, Dad, it's quite simple. You just download an app now and you can have any house you like.
Right.
Any house. And he picked, where do you want to go? A nice top floor apartment with the windows open. And
well, do you see for next week, penthouse suite with a view of the Pacific Ocean.
In Arvely and Omagh.
Confuse them if nothing else.
Right. What would your choice be, Mr. Ford, if you could choose to broadcast from anywhere?
From anywhere? Where would I like to broadcast from? Do you know where I would love to broadcast from? Palermo in Sicily. I was over there 2 years ago and it has suffered the ravages of the Second World War. A lot of buildings have not been replaced. The mafiosa are prominent. The people are the friendliest, the wee windy streets.
Yeah.
And the churches, which are, the architecture is incredible. And one night we were there, we were just walking down the wee windy streets about 9 o'clock and you could hear this mandolin playing. And there was a music shop and there were about 8 musicians just sitting in, drinking beer and wine, playing away. It was like, do you remember what we did in Ferna Cottage?
Very well, yes.
It was the Sicilian version. And it was
lovely.
just incredible. And I thought, I am in hog heaven. You know, when I die, I want to go to Palermo.
Right. Speaking of facades and backdrops, tonight's programme will be one of the finest houses at Omagh, or one of the finest houses maybe in County Tyrone.
Right.
Will be where? Guess.
Oh, an interview we have done. Let me think. We can take Ferna Cottage off. That would be...
Yes.
To me, well, in all honesty, to me, that is the finest house in Omagh.
Well, it certainly is, yeah. Most cracking. This would be slightly bigger. This would be...
Slightly bigger.
Crevenagh House.
Ah, yes.
Home of the late Gerald Darling.
Oh, I remember it well.
Do you?
I do indeed. It still stands there.
Oh, yes.
Looking down over the town of Omagh.
With the little gatehouse.
The little gatehouse, and the gatehouse was burnt down.
It was burnt some years ago, I think, yes.
And they're building a whole raft of new houses.
That would be part of their estate. The Darling estate actually spread over 5,000 acres at a peak. Quite a lot of Omagh, even where the Campsie swimming pools were, where the sports grounds is there, even part of the golf course, but probably all.
And is there a camogie pitch there?
That's it. That would be all Darling's.
Do you remember the beautiful tree that used to stand? The huge, big tree.
Yes.
Gone. So that was part of it. I didn't realise. I remember Mr. Darling talking about land in Donegal. Mm-hmm. And do you remember asking him about you growing up in the house and the friendships were with people of the same social standing it was quite quite limited.
Yeah.
And I do remember the interview because he was such a gentleman, and he made us so welcome.
Very welcome indeed, all right.
And he was very courteous.
He was very patient.
And very open.
Wasn't he just?
And I mean, to get an insight into that.
Yeah, he opened his house and opened his heart as well, because he talked about his life generally and his illness and you know. But the late Miss Crammon mentioned a couple of times to us, she would have referred to the upper 10 in Omagh.
That's right.
The upper 10%, she says, who would have owned 90% of the property and the wealth of the town.
That's right.
And Auchinleck Darling would have been
part of that.
Part of that part of Omagh, yes.
That all changed. I think, I don't know, but maybe an historian out there could maybe identify when that kind of life changed. You know, was it with the First World War?
I think after the First World War, between the First World War and Second World War, and I think what happened is the threshold for capital transfer tax, you know, death duties, I suppose, for want of a better word, it never rose. So that caught a lot of families like that. Before this, that was something that never would have attracted anyone. But then, as the value of the estates went up, then they were caught on a net there, and that a lot of them had to be reduced or sold. And then, I mean, Darling's house at a peak maybe equated 5 or 6 of his staff, and it was a fairly small house compared to some of the big.
And it was, I think it was built around 1810
to 1815. Right. It actually was being considered by the Earl of Belmore to be their family home, that site, you know.
Oh, the site? Right.
Because Auchinleck and Belmore must have been sort of same plantation families or whatever, and they had all looked at various sites and things. So,
right.
I remember that on the tape as well, that he talked about that now. So I think Gerald Darling's father was a clergyman.
Right, okay.
Who was married the daughter of that family. And then the rest, a lot of those Auchinlecks all got killed in the First World War.
That's right, they were very much a military family.
They were
and
big.
Then I think he was born in Ergenagh,
1921. Yes, during the Troubles here at that stage, yes.
And remember he talked about his wartime career in the Royal Navy Reserve, and also flying Spitfires. And then after the war, he went into the law, became a barrister, and then he specialised in
Maritime barrister, yes. I would have seen his name would have turned up in claims and stuff, and I think he was interviewed on TV a few times about shipwrecks and things.
Right,
I think.
Salvage and things
Salvage,
like that.
Yeah. He would have been a specialist, that would have been his thing. And I think he was, you said he was a free man of the city of London.
Free man of the city of London as well,
yeah,
and I think he was awarded a gold medal or some kind of a medal by Lloyd's.
Yeah.
You know, he had a very interesting career, and it was great just to hear him talking about, you know, all those different stages in his life. And do you remember he talked about when he was training to be a barrister, he lived in a shed at the bottom of the garden of the man who was training him, who was his master, as they're called, the barrister. You know, and you know, I just thought I loved the interview because it was so unexpected. I mean, even just walking into the house, and you had those mosaic tiles with the 7 ages of man, and you had Zulu shields and Zulu spears, and I think there was I don't know what you called it, buffet or whatever it is, of an elephant's foot.
Yes, I remember that, right, yeah. I remember the beautiful big library and the mahogany units on the left-hand side, the solid mahogany. I think it came out of Barnescourt, he said originally, that unit. Right. Beautiful home, and a beautiful proportion, that Georgian house, because it's not too big. Some of them are very big, and the beautiful LED light windows are beautiful in it because that's the original glass, and that's a different type of glass than you get today.
They're not a bullseye glass, but they're you know.
You just know when
it's thicker than the normal,
and it's got like a lead sheen on it. Almost, you know that
right.
You can almost see the colours going through it. You know.
Oh no, but it was a very enjoyable interview. And I had a great night just listening to him.
Yes.
Great voice.
Yes. And that you said was his time, and that time is gone, and the house hopefully will enjoy a new lease of life now because it's in private hands. And
it's a listed building.
It's a grade 2 listed building, yes.
So it'll be there.
It'll be there,
hopefully forever and a day.
Hopefully.
And hopefully it'll have a new lease of life.
Yes, indeed it
because
does.
It deserves it.
And the Wigate House, I hope it gets back to life again. I don't think it's down. It's just maybe the roof got caught fire some years ago,
right,
and then hopefully it'll be restored as well. Because I think that sets them off. Those Wigate houses, the Wigate lodges.
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. You know, you think there's another house go up the Ballygolly line. There's a gatehouse when you're quite close to the Ballygolly roundabout, a gatehouse on your left as you're travelling towards it, and you can see the remnants of an old house.
Yes.
With
Yes.
there are pillars.
That's
That's
it,
all
right?
that remains.
Yes.
I'd love to see a photograph of that to see what it was like in its heyday.
I don't know.
You
Was
know.
I don't know who lived there at all. Something tells me it was there of Tyrone or something lived there. I'm not sure. Yeah, and I'm told, I'm not sure, there's supposed to be a tunnel or an underground passageway to that house that takes you right into Ballygolly. But it's not confirmed. But that there was chat. There's an underground passage there. I suppose when you think in Darling's house, he talked about a well in the basement that time for if things got very bad, at least they could hold out.
It was a place of safety.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh no. But those houses were of their time.
They were.
You know, and
Yeah.
And houses that in this day and age, you know, when you think of the mod cons that we have, triple glazed, and then you have central heating and oil heating and whatever. You know, do you remember the fire crackling away in the background?
I do in that room. Yes.
It was actually almost like gunshots.
It was like
Or
firecrackers going off.
Firecrackers going
It
off.
was indeed. Yeah. And
You
that's mainly how he did the house. He said the house was okay in the summer when it lived in, but they didn't live out there all the time. They didn't live there all year because suppose they had other properties and other parts. But he certainly knew the town. And when you met Mr. Darling walking around Omagh, you wouldn't assumed he was a barrister of the quality it was. Not he just dressed in a pair of dungarees and an old leather jacket or an old sports jacket with the leather pads and the elbows, and you know. And walked about and loved his garden. I know I used to call up to see him the odd time on business, and he out with a spade and he grew his peas and garden and stuff. Lovely. And he was a gentleman of his time, you know. So
Well, I look forward to hearing the interview, you know, because it's a little snapshot, and I think we did it in early to mid 90s.
early 90s, I think. Maybe Declan's right.
He died 1996.
Did he indeed? Right.
So
I think it was sold, what, 02 or 03 was it?
I think it was either 04 or 06.
Yes,
you know.
yeah, well.
And, well, I look forward to hearing the interview because I haven't heard it in all those years, you know.
All right, folks, till we see you again, we'll sit back and we'll enjoy the memories of the late and great Gerald Darling. Take care, Declan.
All the best.
Well, it's an absolutely beautiful house, and it's a Georgian house. Have you any idea, Mr. Darling, when the house was constructed, when it was built?
Built in about 1810 or 1815, or thereabouts. And it was built onto an old existing farmhouse. Pictures we've got of it was just bare ground around the farmhouse where all these trees are now and everything. There was nothing. And so it all started from there. So that means that all our trees are now over 100 years old. Beginning to wonder how long they go on living for, you know, all these wonderful beeches and things that are all around the place.
Well, has there been much renovation to the house, or has it remained pretty static over the years?
There have been very few changes. There was a bit built on, really, for guest rooms and odd things, including a bathroom. The only bathroom in the house, in spite of all its grandeur, was in the annex bit where Mrs. Bell lives nowadays. We have a tenant there because we don't need all that room. And that used to be the only bathroom. It was downstairs and it wasn't in the house. But apart from that, there haven't been any changes in the house. We had to buy a new roof the other day. Fortunately, I was in my full earning period as a QC, so we were able to afford it with a little help from the listed building people. The listed building people are rather tiresome because you think you're going to get a lot of money out of them, and then they come and say what standard they want. And so you end up finding the whole thing's much more expensive than you thought. So the money you get out of them really goes on doing the extras that they insist on.
Right.
But the house is unchanged from those days. And architecturally, the two features are a thing called white windows. If you were coming up to it in the daytime, you would find the windows are very, very broad centrally, and then in each side of the main window there's a little thing, and that is to make the house not look too tall, because it is in fact quite tall. You can see from these ceilings. The white windows are an architectural trick for making it not look so tall. It has an advantage because it makes it very attractive outside. It has a disadvantage that there are an awful lot of window panes that leak drafts and leaks through. And then the other feature, these are sort of quite exceptional features in this house. The other features are mahogany doors, and that was a quirk of fate that they came from Demerara with an heiress who was associated with the sugar business in Demerara. And the third feature is a marble floor in the hall depicting the 7 ages of man, right through from the puking infant to the decrepit old man like myself. And each of the 7 ages has a bit. We keep it covered with carpet, so we can roll the carpet back and show you. But those are really the 3 features of the house. Otherwise, it's more or less a standard Georgian house. It is a good one. It has very thick walls. It's very well constructed. Like in this room we're in at the moment, which is called the library, there is about 3 feet underneath. And right in the centre of the house, there's a very nice cellar that you can get down to. And in the cellar is a well, so that in those days they were thinking of defended farmhouses. And, that was to be the last defence. You got your water and everything right down in the centre of the house.
Well, all the fireplaces are all the original fireplaces.
Yes, they are.
Marble.
They're marble. This is a good one. The grate's not the original grate. The grate's a Devon grate for burning turf. You would have had a more ornamental one with bars in it, but these have been converted to burn turf. We now burn logs, as you can see, because we've got plenty of firewood. We harvest them in October to last us through the year. We have lovely.
Is it a cold house in the winter time?
It's cold if you don't live in it, and it's also damp if you don't live in it. If you do live in it, it's fairly easy to keep it warm. You just have to remember not to open the doors and leave them open on damp days, or even on a cold day like today. The cold would come pouring in and run right through if you left the doors open. But if you don't do that, it's not too bad.
And were you born in this house, Mr. Darling?
No. I was born in a rectory at Kappa, about 9 miles from here, in 1921. And I was delivered by Dr. Lagan's father, old Dr. Lagan.
Well, you're a military man, obviously.
No, I'm not. The house is a military house because this is an Auchinleck house, it's not a Darling house. And the reason I'm here is because my grandfather was a very poor curate, and he used to make money teaching, coaching, special coaching for children, and looking after them in the summer holidays and that sort of thing, and doing locum for the local rector. So he came here to do that work for the Auchinlecks, and married the daughter of the house. One of them, there were 2 daughters. One of them had a marvellous house at Rathmullen, which is now a ruin, and the other one married this clergyman from England and went off to England with him. Well, the son of the house here was Dan Auchinleck, and he went off to the First World War and got killed pretty well at the end. It was 1918, wasn't it?
Yeah, 1914.
1914, pretty well at the beginning. And so that left his widow here for, until 1950, 48, until 1948, from 1914. And no male heir. So when she died in 1948, my father inherited, because he was the only male heir through his mother. And that's how the name changed from Auchinleck to Darling. But the the answer to that arose out of your question, am I a military man? It's essentially a military house because nearly all the Auchinlecks were soldiers, the most famous one being Field Marshal Auchinleck, who was a field marshal in the war, in the Second World War. I and my brother, my father was a colonel. I and my brother didn't get on terribly well with my father. Maybe that shouldn't really be in. But we, almost despite him, we both joined the Navy when the war started. I volunteered from school and I joined up as a boy seaman at 18 in 1940 and served in the Navy through to 1946 or 47. So my childhood, or at any rate my adolescence, had disappeared. That's 18 to 24, chasing Germans and Japanese. I had a wonderful cook's tour of the world because we always went east. And my job was to be a sailor and also an air pilot. And I flew Spitfires from aircraft carriers, so it was all very exciting. Whenever you weren't terrified, it was very exciting.
You're too young to be terrified.
Well, you don't believe that anything can happen to you in those circumstances. When I was still 18, I flew an aeroplane into a hillside and broke everything, both my arms and both my legs and my pubis and my pelvis, and my hip was dislocated and fractured across the top. So the doctor came, and as doctors do, put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You needn't think about flying again. You're not going to walk again because this hip's going to heal up fixed." So taking up the point you made about not believing it, I didn't believe that. And I was actually flying 3 months later and did all my war service and flying Spitfires and ending up as a chief test pilot after that happened. But of course it came back on me when I was 65 and I had the usual hip operation and so on. But that's only just because you say you don't believe it. Well, you don't, and you don't believe you're going to get hit. Or that you won't recover. On the other hand, coupled with that, I mean, we keep straying a bit, but coupled with that, you actually, when you're that young, you have a sort of death wish that you wouldn't mind dying because it would be quite pleasant to die before you've really done any harm. It's a sort of very curious attitude which you have, especially if you're flying. Anyway, that's getting rather far from this house.
And then when the war ended, did you go into Civvy Street and then into the law?
The war ended. I had no money at all because there was no backup. My father was very, very badly off. He had by then moved into this house and he hadn't got the money to go with it. And so there was no backup. And I went to Oxford University where I had 3 scholarships waiting for me. You didn't actually have to have a scholarship because if you were an ex-serviceman, you were more or less, if you'd passed in, you were paid for as though you had. But I did actually have 3 scholarships. So I went back to Oxford and read law. The scholarships were in classics, Greek and Latin, but I changed to law. Mainly because I thought it was the only thing that couldn't be nationalised when the Labour government was just getting in there for the first time with Attlee, and I thought, well, being a barrister is one thing that couldn't be nationalised. I expect it could be, but I thought then it couldn't be, so I went for law. And then the next stage in being a barrister is very uncomfortable because you don't earn anything straight away. You do nowadays more than you did then, but you didn't earn anything for years. And the only thing I had in the way of means was a scholarship, which was £4 a week. And so I lived on £4 a week in London, and I can tell you that's very difficult. I did a little bit of jobbing gardening and got the rent for that. but it was the rent of a potting shed at the bottom of a garden in Lancaster Gate, or Paddington. And in return for my keeping the garden, I got that free. It was a tiny little potting shed. You had a little table, a bed, a table, a chest of drawers, and a bookshelf, and with my 1-bar electric cooker, one circle electric cooker, I used to cook and live there. Nowadays you wouldn't be able to live on £80 a week. That would be the equivalent of £4 a week, I think. But it was very, very difficult. However, I got through the stage of what is called pupillage or apprenticeship to be a barrister. And by a sheer fluke, I was offered the chance of specialising in shipping law, ship collisions and salvage. You may have seen me on the television the other day, because one of the big cases I did as Rec Commissioner keeps coming up on the television because they found the wreck very deep down in the Pacific. It's a case called the Derbyshire, and they keep running it through on the television. They occasionally have a picture of me. They're not suggesting that I'm wrong, but what they're suggesting is that there's fresh evidence now, because when we did it, we didn't have any evidence at all. However, this is digressing again. I got through to be qualified as a barrister, and I got this chance of specialising in this particular kind of work. And to cut matters short, I ended up as leader of the Admiralty Bar in England, which is the top place in the world for shipping law. That's why I couldn't do it in Belfast, although I'm a barrister in Belfast also. I'm actually an honorary bencher of the Inn of Court of Northern Ireland. In England, I was a bencher of the Middle Temple and the head of the thing for 1 year.
I lived here for a while. My father was a policeman here in his 50s and in the 70s. So I vowed that I would come back to Omagh. And,
I admired him very much, actually. He was a district inspector.
That's right,
D.I. Ford.
D.I. Ford, that's right.
He was a great guy. He was very nice.
Well,
policemen were very big, had a very big part to play in the society of those days. And, there are all these people like County Inspector Regan and County Inspector Spears and County Inspector Gorman and this District Inspector Moore. They were all sort of quite big in society around Omagh. Curious enough, I keep meeting the Gormans now, because that Gorman was County Inspector here, and his son was in charge of security at London Airport and also of the Hong Kong police at one time. And his grandson was out salmon fishing with me in Scotland last year. He's a grown-up man, but he's actually the grandson of the county inspector I knew when I was a small boy here. And I think with County Inspector Gorman, District Inspector Ford was his DI. I'm not quite sure about that, or whether it was DI Moore. So it all links in, go round and round in circles.
well, in your sojourn in the Navy and in Spitfires during the war, and then in London as a budding barrister, did you come back much to Omagh?
Yes, I used to come back whenever I could. First of all,
Your father died in Port.
My father died in 1958, so from 1958 onwards we've been managing this place from a distance, just on the bar holidays, and with the help of people who live here. We have a pensioner at the Gate Lodge, and we were very lucky to have. We started with 2 women working for us, and they told us really how to live in the house, actually. But we just managed to do it. We put it on the market because we thought we couldn't do it. It hadn't really got very much money. And obviously somebody discovered what the probate price was, which was ridiculously low. And we were offered that for the whole thing. It was about
7,000.
7,000 or something for the whole lot. But on the other hand, it's not quite as ridiculous as it sounds, because we also own Ergenagh House where Mr. Chambers lives now. And I think my father sold that to the Chambers family for $12.50, and he was very pleased to do so. So the prices have changed quite a lot. You know, they suddenly took off. And of course, before that, when my parents used to work abroad quite a lot, I was always left half with my grandmother in Suffolk. That's the Miss Auchinleck grandmother. And half with my other grandmother here, who was Mrs. Moriarty. And Mrs. Moriarty and her daughter, Iris Moriarty, really brought me up almost. I was here an awful lot when I was a kid. Not in this house, though, but with the Moriartys. And so I can say, although I've got a beautiful English accent, I'm actually half a Kerryman, because these Moriartys came from Anascall near Dingle. And so I've got a good pedigree of being half a Kerryman. But the Auchinlecks came here in 1655, I think. First record of them being over here, they came from Scotland, of course, with a Scots name, was at Cleenish in County Fermanagh, which is now Ballinalec, because Cleenish is on an island. And this first Auchinleck to come over was rector of Cleenish. And they go on from there, mostly in Fermanagh. And then they were working for the Belmore family. And they bought the land for this house from the Belmores, actually. This belonged to the Belmores. And curiously enough, the Belmores were thinking of this site rather than Castle Cool for their major house. And it wasn't quite as ridiculous as it sounds, because this is up on a hill here, and the river curls round below us. You can't see it now, because the first thing that happened was the house was built here when it was like that, a lovely site, and you look across to mountains and so on. The first thing that happened was the railway embankment, so you couldn't see much of the river in the back home. The back home's where Dunbreen Rovers have their football pitch. That's my land there, but that used to be part of ours, going straight down to the river, and you could see it from the house. And the next thing that happened was the flood bank, so you couldn't see that bit before they vested all that land of mine for playing fields and things along there. So it was not quite so ridiculous thinking the Belmores were going to build their house here, because it was a lovely site. And it was about a mile out of the town. The town has now grown round us, so we're a little kind of island of green among housing estates like Thornley and so on, which all ring our boundaries. Everybody else all around us are presumably millionaires, while we remain very poor, except we've got nice green land around the house. But the Auchinlecks, having started in 1625 in Ireland, wouldn't really count as Irish, I suppose, but it's very hard to become Irish if you start Scottish. And their history runs through Fermanagh, various jobs in Fermanagh, ending up with working for the Belmores. And then I think things like this marriage to the sugar heiress made it possible to build this house, which they did. And then they were a family of some note. When I was a boy, I used to be very impressed with my important relations living here. When I was stealing fruit out of their garden and so on, it was with some trepidation that my own relations would catch me doing so, because it's quite hard to get into the big walled garden we've got and finish fruit. In those days they had two gardeners too, and a wonderful garden, like a sort of showpiece garden with a beautiful border going up the middle. And there's 2.5 acres of it, and they had every kind of tree and each flower bed round little hedges and things. All that's gone because you couldn't keep that up nowadays.
So the life of the big house has changed over the years.
Completely. But that isn't anything to do with Omagh. That's universal. That kind of lifestyle was really finished in the First World War and staggered on in a fairly broken-backed way until the Second World War. And then I think if you look in England or anywhere around Ireland, it really all came to an end. If you want to live in this house, you have to do it yourself on a do-it-yourself basis. You buy as many machines as you can and hope they will do the work which people used to do when labour was plentiful. Because when I was a small boy, if you wanted to get a cook or a housemaid or anything, you only had to go to Donegal and you would have queues of people wanting to do the work and so on. Nowadays you could put advertisements in the con or anything for domestic work and everybody would say, not for me, I'm not doing that sort of thing. And so that has changed, but that's not specifically Omagh, that's just a big change in society.
Sometimes you say the First World War was the...
Yes, that's when it really all came to an end, really. Because a whole generation of men were killed in that war. It was a very foolish war. And an awful lot of people were killed, which took the heart out of the sort of families who were in these houses. And that applied to Ireland as well, because in spite of being neutral and one thing or another, the Irish of both sides made an enormous contribution to the Second World War, actually, but an even bigger one to the First World War. There are VCs from the Republic of Ireland, like Hegarty Hegan, who drove his ship against a German battleship or something without flinching, with certain death. There are examples like that. But this is getting away from Omagh and away from this house again, sort of rambling.
The military memorabilia, if this is a drum behind...
No,
No, that's a turf basket.
That's
It's
just
got
a
logs
scrap.
in it now.
It's Victorian scraps stuck on an old log box. But there is military memorabilia.
There are a lot of medals and things.
And then I noticed a shield in the Shakespearean Hall.
In the porch.
Where did that come from?
That's a Zulu shield from the Zulu War. And of course we've got a box of medals and appropriate medals for fighting in the Zulu War. Somebody was fighting.
They were all decimated, defending and spreading the empire. That's really why there are no Auchinlecks left now.
There are no Auchinlecks left, but if you go to our church, all the brass plates are to Auchinlecks, shot here and shot there and so on all over the world. There is one to an ex-rector, and he says, I boast...
No, he doesn't. He says, I place it not what he doesn't.
I boast not as others do with dented shield and warriors' shouts or something like that. And that's obviously a hit at all the Auchinleck things all right.
But I think in this family everyone was either in the army or the church.
Yes.
So,
It's just tradition.
yes.
Nobody made any money. Spent their lives and made no money.
But that was generally speaking of the class of people who lived in these houses. That's what they did, really.
Well, the kind of people who lived in houses like this, the big houses, did they integrate much with the locals, or were they pretty much apart?
No. I'm sure they integrated with the locals greatly. With lovely stories. We had Maggie Duncan from Drumnachilly spent her whole life in this house, and she told stories of how Mrs. Auchinleck, who was a great fisherwoman, would occasionally get the gilly in, and the kitchen would be cleared, and the gilly was very good on the
That's Willy Whirling.
squeezy
The accordion?
accordion, and they would dance, and Mrs. Auchinleck was a widow here for years, but young officers would come out from the camp and they would take a turn and they would all have a dance in the kitchen. I think they integrated greatly in a very nice way. But there was a complete society. A house like this would have had an enormous amount of retainers associated with it, and there were a lot of houses like this. So it was a society. Also, there was no transport, so you had to make your fun where you were. And
there's a room out of the back called the Servants' Hall, and a great big table. And at one end would have been the housekeeper, and the butler probably, and they were the head and foot of the table, and then all the other people who worked in the house would be lined up on each side of the big table, and they would have done very well. They were intended to do very well on the class of food they got and everything, and they had their own rules. Probably you saw that film Upstairs, Downstairs. Well, that's the same kind of thing, but I mean, that was happening here as well, except it wasn't downstairs because it was on the same level.
But there was that hierarchy?
Yes, there's that hierarchy among people who were working here.
But I know also this Maggie, who we were very fond of. We went once, my husband's aunt and uncle were in charge of Spring Hill for the National Trust, and they invited us over in the spring when the house wasn't open to have afternoon tea with them, and I took Maggie and her friend Mrs. Tracy, who lived up in the top of the town, and we went over, and it was the most memorable tea party because Mr. Butler showed them all around the house, and we went into the different rooms and they would look at the great fireplaces in Spring Hill and they would say, my goodness, that would have been a good hour's work at 7 o'clock in the morning cleaning that fire and getting it all ready for the next day, and that they took great interest, both of them, in what amount of work would have had to be done in these houses, and they knew it all.
Mrs. Tracy is interesting because dear Mrs. Tracy was the most true other person you could possibly imagine. She lived on that very, very steep hill that goes up from John Street to the Church of Ireland Church. There's a little very, very steep hill, and she lived on the right in a little cabin. Must have been incredibly difficult to live there, very noisy and really very hard to keep it clean or anything. But that's where she lived. And she was a very keen Roman Catholic, and Maggie was a very staunch, I think she'd have been a Paisleyite probably. And come Christmas Day, we always had Mrs. Tracy. We had to go and collect Mrs. Tracy to share Christmas dinner with Maggie. So Maggie had somebody to, and they got on like a house on fire. Mrs. Tracy had the most mischievous sense of humour. It was great, great fun. But how she lived in that awful place, I don't know. I don't suppose there's anyone living there. In fact, I think there's
I think they're tumbled.
They're either tumbled or there's some kind of small cafe or something there now. I hardly ever need to go up or down that because you can go round.
Well, there's a great nostalgia for the past, for the old cottage, the old thatched cottage, this romanticised quiet man image. And I think there's maybe an equal amount of nostalgia for houses like this. When you see a programme or read the books of Somerville and Ross,
yes.
The old house, there's a certain romance tinge to it, but the reality must have been quite different. So you mentioned the cold winters earlier on.
Cold, and it depends on the family too. I mean, some families were nice and integrated, as my wife was saying, and treated the people who worked for them well. Other families, usually because they weren't quite sure of themselves, were pretty nasty. I mustn't get on the famine, but it was an accident waiting to happen. Because you see, it's very hard to imagine 8 million people living in Ireland. And there's 4 million people now. And out of that 4 million, we have 1.5 up here, and they have 2.5 in the south. And of their 2.5, 4/5 live in Dublin. And so the rest of there used to be twice as many people. It's very difficult to know where they all lived, except when you go out on the mountain. You used to go out grouse shooting when I was young. There's no grouse nowadays. You can actually see where the farms went higher and higher up the mountain, and little gardens and walled off very carefully, but which obviously people emigrated and died and so on, round about the famine time. But it was almost certain to happen because there was too much dependence on one crop. And when that failed, 3 years running, that was bound, things were bound to go wrong. They weren't bound to go as dreadfully wrong as they did, because when you read, there's one terribly good book on it called The Great Hunger by Cecil William Smith, and they were actually exporting grain from down in the south while they were importing maize here. And of course nobody would eat maize because Kellogg's cornflakes and things and corn on the cob hadn't been invented. People were just handed maize and say, make some flour out of this. Well, of course, it wasn't in the nature of Irish people to eat that sort of stuff, even when they were starving. So that made it even worse. I mean, it must have been simply horrible. But the point of getting onto the famine was that it depended there what the landlords were like and whether the landlords were on the spot. I mean, some of them weren't even in Ireland and left it to an agent to look after things, and that sometimes turned out well. But in the end, it depends on people, what sort of people they are.
Well then, would your family have had tenants in this vicinity?
Yes, they had tenants. You know that bridge on the road to Kesh, which has recently been widened as a crossroads there. It's called Curran-y-Malkin round there. Well, all those lands were Auchinleck lands, and up on Burla Mountain, which is the mountain you can see from that bridge, they had lands all round there. And somewhere, I think we've got it in London actually, a little picture of the cabin which Molly Mina lived in, who was a great favourite of the family. They had about 5,000 acres. And then the Land Acts came along to try and provide land for peasants. Because unfortunately, by the Brecon law, which is the Irish law, you divided and divided and divided. So the little plot of land you had, say 1 acre or half an acre, the two sons each had to have 1/4 of an acre. And then it would go on until people were trying to farm, make a living out of a sort of postage stamp. You couldn't do it. And that was the Brecon law. Well, to try and correct that, they had the Land Acts and took the land away from the landowners and paid them some kind of recompense for the land.
Paid them handsomely. They were pleased with it at the time.
Yes, some kind of recompense for the land, which took away the rental, took away the land, and then the land was divided among the tenants. So they got more and didn't have to pay rent anymore. And the landlords were left with some money, but no land anymore. And
the money got spent.
The money, of course, got spent mainly on horse racing and gambling and so on. And I suppose on getting nice salmon fishing. We've got a 35-pound salmon here that was caught down near Ballyshannon on the River Ann before the hydroelectric scheme. It was a lovely river with very, very large salmon. And the gilly that my wife was mentioning, Willie Whirling, and my great-uncle Dan, There's pictures of them. It took them hours to raise this thing because it was 35 pounds and a huge tail on it. It was very difficult. But those were the sort of way in which time was spent, fishing and shooting and so on.
And any games or pastimes around the house, with tennis, billiards?
Yes, there was a tennis court outside this window here, but it was always pointing in the wrong direction. The tennis court, you want the sun to go across the net, don't you? Not into your eyes if possible. This one was situated wrong, and very, very hard to keep a grass court in Omagh. Although when I was a boy, there were, I think, 18 grass courts in the Omagh Tennis Club. And once a week, among the ladies of Omagh, they had a rota of who would provide the tennis tea. This was a great social kudos. To be your tennis tea was a great social occasion. And each lady provided in turn, tried to have bigger and better cakes and so on. And of course, everybody, you wouldn't dare go there, even a small boy like me, I suppose. When I went there, I was up to 17, sort of up to just before the Second World War. Well, you wouldn't dare go without your long white flannels, no shorts or anything like that. Your decent shirt with buttoning arms and some kind of blazer or dark coat, and then you must not go with your shirt open. You had to have a little silk scarf which you made into a tie and tied it over so that filled in your shirt. Well, if you didn't go like that, I mean, people would say, what's wrong with that boy there? He doesn't seem to know how to dress or something. You won't ask him again. Things were like that in those days. But I have a kinsman who was a well-known peer from round here. I won't mention his name. Very eccentric. And he was eccentric in many ways because there were trains in Omagh. We all travelled by train up to Belfast and the Liverpool boat and so on. He used to turn up in a rather ramshackle but very grand for those days Austin, and his attendant would get out with a wicker hamper, a large wicker hamper, and that was taken into his first-class carriage. But his next brother used to go into the second-class carriage with a small packet of sandwiches. Well, this same man was at one of these tennis teas where everybody else was behaving extremely well, and somebody said, would you like some cake, my lord? So I said, yes, certainly, love it. I'll have that big sticky one. So somebody handed him the plate, the sticky one, and instead of having just a slice, he had the whole cake. Right round, and that was it. He was a huge man. But his descendants are extremely nice people and don't eat complete cakes. They're still around.
Well then, in your younger days, when you were here, what about entertainment? Where did you go for entertainment? Was it contained within the house or within these houses?
Entertainment primarily was various forms of shooting and fishing and so on, which you, according to how well off you were, you could find it. My favourite place for fishing was Loch Macrory, and I used to bicycle out the whole way to Loch Macrory to go fishing, spend a day fishing there, and then bicycle back. I used to always go one way and come back the other way. The Cookstown Road in those days wasn't straightened out the way it is now, so you would go the Cookstown way, but as far as I remember there were more hills on the Cookstown way than there were on the Carrickmore Road, so you went by the Carrickmore Road and came back by the Cookstown Road. There are two ways of going to Loch Macrory. But the point was that in those days you found your own fun because you were prepared to bicycle 12 miles. You didn't wait until you could own a car or pester your parents to drive you out there or anything. But then there were dances, usually with orange squash, and with very severe controls on behaviour. I mean, if you were caught kissing somebody, you would probably get kicked out. And of course there was the county cinema and the Star Ballroom and Cinema next door to our own bakery, the model bakery, and that's now all part of the Tech, the back regions of the Tech of where it used to be the Star. It had slightly more risque films. A risque film was a film that showed somebody's knee, more or less. The county was very reliable and posh. You used to take an expensive seat in the gallery for 1 shilling and 1 penny, I think it was, in old money. But if you were really bust, you could all go in a gang and take a 9-penny seat in the down below. You were fairly secure. It was actually a very nice cinema. It was run by Mr. Donaghy, whose house is just by the Swinging Bars roundabout. Those were the sort of entertainments, actually. And then once a year, the circus used to come around. I can't remember whether it's Fossett's or whether it had a more Irish name, but it used to be a great annual event when the circus came. You went to that, and you might possibly go up to Belfast for the pantomime at the Royal Opera House or something once a year. But that was entertainment. I myself, having 2 grandparents who were both clergymen, entertainment at any rate one of the rectories was entirely composed of biblical quizzes, biblical board games, biblical this, that and the other. The result was that I learnt my Bible terribly well, but it wouldn't sound very exciting to a child nowadays to say, well, everything's going to be biblical. Although the board games are the same old board games, but they were all about biblical characters and things. But those were the sort of entertainments. Oh, and of course there was the hunt. The Seskinore Harriers was going strong, and with luck you could get some sort of pony and go out with the Seskinore Harriers. And they had a point once a year at Strabane. A very ramshackle affair, really. I remember once we were going to one jump, and there were 2 old ladies wearing black shawls, as they did in those days. There was a manner of dressing where people dressed in black dresses and wore black shawls. And 2 of these ladies were walking across from one jump to another with me. And one of them said to the other, "Come on over here, Maud. By the grace of God, we'll see a corp." And that was the sort of fun of the thing. You might see somebody breaking their neck at any moment, but that was more important really than the result of the horse race. Fishing starts in April the 1st, or there's other fishing, like salmon fishing's going on now in the Bandaraha and about 1 or 2 rivers are very early. Shooting goes on until February the 1st. So the shooting people are shooting from September the 1st to February the 1st. And then there's a month, February, where nothing happens. And then you start fishing at the end of February maybe, and fish through until the end of September. There's an overlap there. And the same thing with hunting. That starts in the autumn when the foxes have reared their cubs. You have some cub hunting to suss out and find out where the cubs are, perhaps kill them to please the farmers and so on. And then you start in earnest until the breeding. It's related to the breeding seasons of the various quarries, because it's considered unsporting to interfere with them when they're breeding. It's as simple as that, really. Tennis was governed by the weather, not by the breeding season of anyone, because they're only human beings. taking part, and they breed all the time. They don't have a set season for it. So that was just governed by the weather. The courts being grass courts, you had to wait until you got some dry weather, or you couldn't possibly pretend to play tennis on them even. Until they got those red courts, were considered the most amazing modern thing. And on two-car courts.
Well, when did you come back here to live permanently?
Well, only last year, or the year before. I only retired from the bar about a year ago.
But we spent about 6 months, well, I spent about 6 months of the year here for a long time.
Yes.
So,
Did you find it a culture shock
yes.
to come back here to the
It's a complete culture shock. It's a very different way of, very different outlook, I think.
I didn't find it a culture shock at all.
No, it's interesting. You never did, but I found it a total culture shock living in London and living in Omagh. It's just, I think, the outlook of people. I find it very easy to get on with people in Omagh. The English are very law-abiding.
Yes, they actually like obeying the law. It's very odd.
Not at all devious.
She is Australian, so she's more like Irish. She doesn't like obeying the law very much and possibly help it. The English seem to actually enjoy it.
Well,
go out of their way to obey it.
Like the law here interferes with life.
Yes, it does.
No, but you make your life fit in. The law can fit in with your life here. The English people would take it more seriously.
You're Australian?
Yes.
You're born in Australia. Have you been back in Australia, or do you
Sometimes we go back, but it's a long way. I love going back. It's great fun, but and they come over here and visit. So
what do they think of Omagh?
I don't know. They like it. I think it depends really on how the weather is, and nice trips to Donegal and things to do.
Yes, we're almost professional guides to Donegal, because all our visitors take them round the same track pretty well.
But you must have seen a lot of changes in Omagh over the years.
Well, my wife would agree with that. I'm not, and those were your opening remarks, but I think there's more that hasn't changed in Omagh than there is that has changed. Of course it's changed in the way that everything does in towns. They sprawl and they spread. And, there's an awful lot that's the same. There's the same families. If you go through the list of people in our parish, they're the same names. They've been all my life. They haven't changed that much. The courthouse is still where it always was. A lot of shops have changed, but then you see that's not specifically Omagh, that's everywhere. We've got a book there of 1875 or something, and there were 5 clock makers in Omagh. We've got a grandfather clock out there that was actually made in Omagh, and there were 5 clock makers. There were so many whitesmiths, and there were so many blacksmiths, and so on. This is only about 100 years or 120 years ago. Omagh was full of craftsmen, full of retailers. Even when I was a small boy, there was the 3 Anderson shops. There was one on the corner, which is now, what's it called now? The draper.
Nicol and Shields.
The Nicol and Shields. That was one of the Anderson brothers. Where the Struhl Bridge goes across, that was the other Anderson brother, was the principal grocer in the shop. And the last one was the ironmonger, still where it's still there, where it always was. But there were shops like that. Those were traditional shops. That was a draper, that was an ironmonger selling you nails and things by the half-pound or the ounce or whatever you wanted. Instead of saying, oh, you want a 1/2-inch screw, well, you have to buy this pack of 10 screws, and you have to buy a barrow as well, and then you've got the screw you want. It was a different system. They really were ironmongers, and the grocer, Mr. Anderson, used to stand outside his front door with little twists of sweets in a paper made into a sort of cone, and 2 or 3 sweets, I suppose, in them. As people went past, he used to say, "Come in, here's a sweet little boy," and all this sort of thing. And he would be, if you say, "I want some flour," instead of saying, "Well, we'll have a packet of this ready packaged flour," he'd get a sack and a scoop and say, "How much do you want?" He'd say, "A pint," say, weigh out a pint on his scales. And then you'd give him the money and it would go off in one of these air control things which disappear like a rocket into them. I mean, it was all quite different. But that isn't only Omagh, that's everywhere has changed from that.
You'd only find that in the folk park now.
Or in the clinic in the hospital, because when I go along for my leukemia clinic, the blood is whizzed round the hospital in exactly the same thing as Andersons used to have in their shop, a sort of air control thing. You let it off and it disappears. This is the Tyrone Almanac and Directory for 1872, and it cost 1 shilling, which in those days would probably be quite expensive. But you're just dipping into the Omagh Directory. Bakers, there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, 14, 15 different bakers. There were bonnet makers. There were only 3 of them. There was Doran, Johnson and McFarland. Butter merchants, there were 6 or 7 of those. Cabinet makers and undertakers, Pollock wasn't in business then, he was a butcher. There was Houston and McGowan. Carpenters, there's a whole list of those. Where are these whitesmiths? The dressmakers, tons of them. I wish it was like that now. Druggists, curious enough, there are only 2, Lyons and McAdam. McAdam was presumably the predecessor of McAdam and Bates. Right. Egg merchants, there are dozens. Oh, and here's an interesting one, emigration agents. Carson, Elliott, Moore, McMaster and Waterson. J&R. J&R Waterson then went into coal merchants. Oh, they're already in as coal merchants. And emigration, I suppose that's a travel agent department. And then, of course, they're in the Royal Arms. And grocers, absolutely tons. Starting with Alcorn, which is rather interesting, because Alcorns are farmers now. They're very big farmers. Devlin, Lyons, Murphy, McAdam, McAleer, McDevitt, McGinn, McGovern, McHugh, McKelvey, MacDonald rather than O'Donnell, McPhillamy, you don't come across that much now, and Nugent, and then a lot of Somerville. James Somerville was a barber in my day. Gunpowder merchants, Caldwell and Carson, Crawford, Houston, Wilson and White. Haberdashers, a great insurance agents, there are millions of them. Dickey was one. The Dickeys then went into being solicitors later on. Hide merchants, there's 4 of them. Horseshoers and blacksmiths, there's 7 of those. The last one's Slevin, they've gone in for being chemists now.
That's right.
Auctioneers. Hotels, there was Mrs. Clements of the Eagle Hotel. There was Francis Dugan of the Farmers Hotel in George Street, John Holmes of the Hotel in James Street, William Mullen of the White Hart. The White Hart is where the post office is now, McConnell of the Stuart Arms in Abbey Street, and Porter of the Royal Arms Hotel. Porter's had it for a very long time.
That's right where the Porter room is now.
Yes, I think so.
It's a memory of that.
It's a memory of that, I think.
So then Parnell spoke outside the White Hart Hotel.
Yes, well that's a bit further on up the street. Well then there are all these various nail manufacturers. There are only 2 nail manufacturers. milliners, lodging houses. We haven't got to these whitesmiths yet, have we? Here they are. There's 6 whitesmiths. There's Curry, and 3 Hamiltons at different addresses. Kevlin Road and Castle Lane. MacDermott, he's a gunsmith as well in Castle Street. McGuinness in Kevlin Road. Kevlin Road was Kivlin Road in those days. And Michael Slevin in George Street. Those are all whitesmiths. I think they mean tin merchants, and but I don't really know.
One of them is a goldsmith, so it must be.
Yes.
You're working with metal.
Oh, it's definitely some kind of metal work. Yes, MacDermott's a gunsmith as well. And then there are 7 salt merchants. J and R Waterson are into that as well. They seem to be in everything.
They seem to try everything once.
Yeah. But it's quite interesting. I mean, all that activity was going on. And instead of having a few boutiques selling knickers and things, you have all this sort of creative activity. People could do anything. You could find somebody to do anything. Dozens of butchers here, incidentally.
And a lot of these businesses seem to have been centred within the town itself.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
And maybe that's the big change.
They're all in Market Street or George Street or James Street or John Street, which is right in the town.
And now there's very few people living in the town centre.
And they
Yes.
all lived above, even when I came here, everyone lived above the shops, and it was very nice. They all had lovely gardens at the back.
Yes, the last one was Eileen's friend who lived above Crawford and Wilson, and she went on living there.
Miss Crawford, yes.
Miss Crawford. She only died a couple of years ago. She went on living. She had a very nice flat above Crawford and Wilson. Or the old Crawford and Wilson front.
That was the trouble, stopped that though, didn't it, the bombs? They all had to leave then, it was too unpleasant.
That's right. And then you remember the town hall, there used to be a nice frontage to the town hall.
Yes.
Vanished, and it's nearly like a fort in Beau Geste.
They're talking of having a theatre there, but I think it'd be wiser to start. Oh, I don't know, perhaps there's room there.
When you were younger, you had the cinemas. And
Yes.
what about plays?
No, I
Did you
think they
go?
need a theatre. I think it'd be marvellous to have
The players came in later with that chap Paddy, whatever his name was.
McElhinney.
McElhinney, he was frightfully good producer of plays. That didn't come in until later on, I don't think. Because it really only lasted with him, didn't it?
That's right. It would be the 1940s and 50s, and
I
then
think so.
ground to a halt then.
Yeah.
And I mean, I was looking through an Ulster Herald from 1941, and it was amazing the amount of amateur productions that were on in the not only in the town of Omagh but in the surrounding villages.
Yeah.
And the town hall fully used over Easter.
Yes.
Yes.
Amazing.
Oh, and public rooms in the courthouse and all sorts of things. There used to be a lot of dances when you got to dancing age. There was a dance every year in the Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital. Dance in the courthouse. And then there were dances at places like Enniskillen. I remember I went to one dance in Enniskillen and we met up with a dentist. And he gave us ether cocktails in his surgery, which was to help buck the thing up a bit. And I remember the awful drive back from Enniskillen because it was a twisted road, it was the Ballinamallow Road. And these trees kept leaping out of the dark at you, or, where you didn't think there were any trees at all. Suddenly there'd be a tree standing straight in front of you the whole way back to Omagh.
'Tis many's a gay night from dark till daylight I spend with people of high renown. But in all their grandeur and heaps to squander, my heart would wander for sweet Omagh town.